Unwrappers, Ollie here. As you might have noticed, last week's episode of The Week Unwrapped did not show up in your podcast feed as usual on Friday morning. The reason for that was we just finished our recording on Thursday when it became clear that the Queen was unwell. And now that a few days have passed, we thought you might be interested to hear what we thought last week was going to be remembered for when we got together on Thursday morning, a few hours before the news took a very different turn. We will be back as usual on Friday to unwrap this week, but now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 10th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Liz Truss becoming leader of the Conservative Party and Britain's Prime Minister, a stabbing spree in Saskatchewan, Canada, leaving 10 people dead and 19 injured, and on telly, Thomas the Tank Engine getting his first autistic friend, Bruno the brake car. We're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin. From the Week magazine, it's Leif Arbuthnot. And we welcome back book reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. And Mariana, I am curious, have you ever read any of Liz Truss's books? Because they've suddenly taken on far more significance than anyone would have ever thought they'd have.
I don't think I can answer this question. So I have not, but I don't think this looks very good on me. So maybe, although I have not read her book, she has had a speech at Chatham House where the journal is based recently. So I had the pleasure of listening to her share her insights as opposed to having to read cover to cover.
Interesting the use of the word pleasure in that sentence. There we are, how things change. You are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has Algeria said au revoir to French?
I think it will get to a point where it might replace French, actually, because when I see the elderly people, those French-speaking people, they take a lot of interest in learning English, and that's rather surprising.
Jalil Gossab from Algerian Language College, the British Institute, speaking to Associated Press back in 2017. Mariana, what's happened this week?
This week, President Macron has visited Algeria and he's keen on renewing ties after following months of tensions and in light of geopolitical but also soft power concerns. So one of the main reasons for Macron's visit this time around is that recently the Algerian president, Abdelmadjid Tebboune, has announced that English will be taught in primary school starting this year, which sort of entrenches the country's pivot away from French and towards English as a second language starting this upcoming academic year.
Yes, and for people that hadn't noticed that shift that the Algerian president made, Mariana, back in July, it was kind of literally written under Macron, wasn't it? Because he was standing at a podium that said Presidency of the Republic in English instead of Présidence de la République in French.
Yes, and that's really, really interesting because the use of French has been part of this complicated legacy of the colonial era. It is used in public administration, businesses, and universities, but it doesn't actually have an official status in the country, although it is spoken by a third of the Algerian population.
Leif, what's the reaction been to this in France?
I think it's causing some disquiet. French people, some of them have quite a complicated relationship with Algeria. Obviously, this year is 60 years since Algeria became independent from France, which was its kind of colonizing force from the sort of mid-19th century. And people in Algeria, well, some people have been saying that the French language is the kind of colonizer's tongue, and this move to push away from French is kind of likened to casting off the shackles of that colonial past. But in France, where lots of Algerian people live, there's been a kind of complicated reaction to it. But some people, especially younger people, I've been seeing, sort of interpreting this very calmly, whereas other people see it almost as an insult to the French language. My suspicion is as well that Macron probably won't be very pleased about this because he has a really passionate relationship with the French language. He's a great reader of Balzac and sort of, the great French novelists. And so the idea that Algeria is kind of casting off the language that he so adores probably hasn't landed very well with him.
It's so interesting, though, isn't it, Kari, how different languages are seen in different parts of the world. I mean, the president of Algeria, President Tebboune, said, quote, "French is a spoil of war, but English is an international language." You know, as if English couldn't also be said to be a spoil of war in lots of countries around the world. And yet, obviously, that's not how it's perceived in Algeria, where that's how they see French because of colonialism.
No, but I mean, supporters of this move to start teaching English in primary school rather than in secondary school, which is currently the case, they argue that as well as being a chance to shake off the colonial past, it's also English is just useful. It's by far the most studied language in the world. 1.5 billion people are currently learning it, apparently, as compared to France, which is the next most studied language with only 120 million. And, language is power. Critics of this move say that it's politically motivated and that it's aimed at quelling criticism of the government because, how the language we use and the sentence structures we use, I mean, it's a chicken and egg relationship, but it does to some extent define our thinking.
Poulet enough.
Yeah, see, my own French education was pretty poor.
Mariana, you were nodding through that.
Yes, I was just thinking in terms of skepticism that the measures or the announcement will actually be implemented. Although the academic year is starting a few weeks later, there are concerns about the lack of qualified teachers and teaching materials available. And so the success of the initiative will sort of depend on the process of implementation. So the Ministry of National Education has said that out of the roughly 20,000 primary schools, they need 25,000 more English teachers. And so far, only about 5,000 more have been hired.
And it's worth pointing out, actually, this isn't the first time that Algeria has tried to ditch French. In the 1970s, there was a push towards the Arabization of the language, and that largely failed because of a lack of properly qualified teachers. So they really need to get it right this time because the last attempt was a major loss of face.
But just to be clear, Mariana, because you said that French wasn't the official language of Algeria, what is? What do they speak in Algeria?
Yeah, so Algeria has two official languages, Arabic and Tamazight, which I'm probably completely butchering the pronunciation of.
Okay, so we're talking about a fight for the third language being spoken. Is this actually something that really matters on its own terms, or is the motivation behind bringing it up, as you alluded to in your intro, Mariana, really about getting Macron to Algeria if he turned up because of this provocative move? Is there something else going on behind the scenes?
I think there's a good point to raise here, which is Macron's visit was aimed at resetting relations. So it was ending months of tensions after the French president accused Algeria of instrumentalizing its colonial past. And Algeria had even recalled its ambassador at the time. Relations were at a very low point. And obviously, there's also the idea of a soft power battle because Algeria is the third largest French-speaking country in the world, so it does matter as a place to spread cultural influence and also for France to defend its interests.
Leave.
What I'm also interested in about this is that it sort of captures a kind of move away of Algeria from the kind of French sphere of influence. The Algerian president mentioned at a press interview quite recently about that Algeria might design something called BRICS, which is a sort of economic organization whose countries are in the sort of acronym, so that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And so there's a funny thing going on here where, although it looks like Algeria is sort of pivoting to the West with this English language move, at the same time, it seems to be flirting with a kind of a new sort of alliance that has become more and more important in the past few years, that involves kind of, these less democratic or in fact non-democratic countries, including Russia, which obviously has a lot of significance given the situation with Ukraine right now, and crucially China.
Yeah, Kari, there's a whole sort of forgotten history, really, of Algeria's closeness with the EU, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, Algeria was actually an initial member of the EU's predecessor, the post-war European Economic Community. It was known as the Seventh State, and yet its involvement in European integration has largely been erased from the EU's history. And obviously now Algeria is really able to flex its muscles again because, in large part, because it has really big gas stores, natural gas stores, which obviously at the moment everyone wants. So there's been a real power shift particularly between Algeria and France, because France is losing influence in the region, across the African continent, where, which is now being wooed by China and Russia. So Algeria's really got this opportunity to sort of pick a side and be wooed and see what the best deal it can get from each side is going to be.
The thing is, though, is this just sort of rearranging furniture on the Titanic? Because the language of social media is English, isn't it? Or Chinese. But, for most people in Algeria, the social media they're going to be looking at is in English, not French. And that sort of suggests that this whole soft power notion that we do with the BBC as well, that France does, of let's have a couple of news channels in French, would make any difference at all anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the underrated factors here is sort of pop culture. It seems that Algerians are not that excited by French popular culture and French music, but they're more interested in American celebrities and American music and sort of TV products. And so I think that's playing a bit of a role. Another thing that this is kind of touching on is this this long running history of French institutions and sort of France generally being quite neurotic about the changing nature of language. The French Académie Française, has been always notorious for trying to control the spread of English within the French language itself. It's always coming up with French versions of email, of words like email, because they don't want this kind of pollution. I'm quite amused by all these attempts because it seems so completely fated to failure, and it's like watching people run into a brick wall over and over again.
Indeed. Okay, Kari, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is dark tourism taking us to morally dark places?
Well, the radiation is always in the back of your head, but I wanted to see this all so badly that it was a risk I was willing to take. I think, my mom at home is probably not thinking that way, but, for me it was a risk I was willing to take.
Tourism in Chernobyl, a video from TRT World's YouTube channel. Kari, what's the story?
So, there we heard a tourist to the site of the power plant explosion in 1986. And this became a major tourist draw after the 2019 release of the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. That triggered a 40% increase in visitor numbers. And in fact, it was then made a official tourist attraction by the Ukraine government.
Okay, thank you for the history lesson. What's happened this week?
As we all know, Ukraine is now at war. And yet, despite this, there's an online platform called Visit Ukraine Today that was launched back in July, is now offering tours of the so-called brave cities of Ukraine that are resisting the Russian invaders. So visitors get a chance to walk among bomb debris, dodging landmines, and actually quite reasonably priced if you're interested, from about €10 apparently to visit these cities, including Kyiv and Odessa. Obviously, this raises some questions about the ethics of what is called dark tourism. So this is an example of this increasing taste, if you like, among tourists to visit places associated with tragedy. And this isn't a new trend. I mean, there were aristocratic tourists who watched the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, for example. But affordable air travel, media coverage of global conflicts, the rise of off the beaten track, it's all really fueled this push to commercialize, some would say to commercialize human suffering.
Except for the people of Ukraine, revitalizing tourism is part of getting back on their feet, isn't it? And, when you're in a tourist authority, you're going to look around and think, what have we got to offer? Obviously, war tourism is one of those things at the moment.
Yeah, I think this all boils down to a really key point about dark tourism. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. I think it's all about intention of both the visitors and of the people offering these experiences. And yes, there are definitely advantages of dark tourism for the local community, for example, because it can cash in at a time when it really does need this money. It's also at the same point, these visitors, if they get themselves into trouble, who's going to get them out of it? There are international guidelines against visiting Ukraine. The Ukraine government has said to, quote, wait until after we win the war before you come and visit. So I think there are all sorts of issues. And frankly, if I were, fighting Russian invaders, I don't think I'd appreciate turning around and seeing a load of tourists snapping their cameras at me.
It's so interesting, though, isn't it, Mariana, the timing? Because that's kind of what we're getting at here. If there isn't, as Kari says, anything intrinsically ethically wrong in going to Chernobyl or going to, Auschwitz or the Cambodian killing fields, then the only difference now is the time. It's the fact that it hasn't been a few years, it's happening now. When does it become ethically okay?
I don't think I hold the answer to that, but to something that Kari was saying about, it's about the intentions of the tourists. Obviously, when you judge the whether something is morally good or right or wrong, it's either about intentions or consequences. And I was thinking about whether it should be more of a focus on consequences, and whether it's about these visits bringing agency to the victims. So much like war journalists or other sorts of people who go to war-torn zones and even to migrant camps, just go and tell the stories of the people that are going through the suffering, as opposed to providing entertainment, let's say.
And I think that's an issue also. You talk about, what about the timeline? Is it okay if it's a historical site? I mean, the Roman catacombs, we visit those. Is that morally off bounds? Because ultimately,
Right.
yeah.
Pompeii was not a pleasure cruise,
Exactly.
was it?
But I think also, even when we're talking about, very far off events, I think it's really important to ask whose voices we're hearing. The victor writes history. So, and this sort of binary presentation of the victims and the perpetrators in conflict zones as distinctive and exclusive categories can really fuel ongoing tensions. So it can be used for political gain in today.
It also speaks something to human instinct, though, doesn't it? In that people leave are always interested in, when things turn bad. That's the interest in true crime podcasts, for example, isn't it? And I suppose, in a strange sort of way, seeing it face to face, confronting the misery in front of your very eyes, at least you're not at one remove like you are when you listen to Serial.
Yeah, and there's something about the era of sort of fake news. Maybe people are a bit more motivated to go and see for themselves rather than seeing everything through this kind of film, of the kind of mainstream media, as it's often termed. We have obviously seen some very high profile kind of touristy trips by foreign politicians, but also some actors. So I think there's something maybe slightly snobbish about saying, well, only the great and the good can go and visit these places, but normal people who want to spend their money doing that shouldn't. At the same time, I think there's a real danger here that it could just add pressure on the situation, and sort of, if you're a Ukrainian soldier, yes, you don't want to be ogled at, but more importantly, you probably don't want any of your resources to be spent on, vaguely trying to protect people who are idiots and who've just turned up in a kind of field of war. So that's probably should be factored in as well. I do think this taps in, as you say, to a completely deep-seated and probably even evolutionary need to see how things can go wrong, and to sort of, we're all interested in seeing sites of devastation, which is quite ghoulish, but it's been happening, as Kari says, for literally hundreds and hundreds of years.
It's interesting, actually, what you were saying about the visits of world leaders and celebrities to Ukraine, because the company that have launched these tours say that was the inspiration behind these tours. And that quote, caring people want to see the traces of war with their own eyes to convey the truth to the world. So, I'm not convinced by it in this particular instance, but there is a case to be made that it helps us to understand the present and be more thoughtful about the future, and deepens our capacity for compassion and empathy if we see these things firsthand.
But isn't that tremendously self-indulgent as well, Mariana? If you're lucky enough, if you're fortunate enough not to be directly affected by this horrendous war that's happening in Europe at the moment, to say, well, I can only understand it if I go and insert myself in it, is so narcissistic, isn't it? I mean, we can read about what's happening. We can see footage from people that's there. Why would you go on a sort of trip to experience it yourself? Can't you take people's words for it when they are trying to flee the country in their hundreds of thousands?
I think to play devil's advocate to that is that not all voices get to be heard, and obviously media also only has access to so many people. But I don't think fundamentally the reason why it's dark tourism is because, like Kari was talking about, intentions is that they're not necessarily going there to get a better picture of the overall conflict. But there are other examples when it comes, such as when it comes to like Holocaust museums, where dark tourism can actually spark motivation for social change. And actually, found it not only can trigger, according to this study I came across, it can trigger self-reflection, but also, more curiously, museums that are focused on war can actually create or cause anger towards the government, and the sort of like create that sort of a movement within within your society when you bring back these lessons.
Yeah, actually, talking about research, there's actually an Institute for Dark Tourism Research at the University of Central Lancashire, and there's a leading expert in this field called Philip Stone, who incidentally used to manage a holiday camp in Scotland. I'm not making any insinuations, but he's actually said dark tourism doesn't need dark tourists. It just needs people who are interested in learning about this life and this world. And I think that's certainly the biggest argument in favour of the trend.
Leave.
One of the issues here seems to me that there is no shortage of Ukrainian voices currently reporting on what's going on. We have loads of refugees who are currently in the UK who are not that difficult to find. You can go and talk to them yourself. And there's lots of really sterling reporting coming out of Ukraine. So, Olly, I kind of agree that this impulse to go and see it for yourself is quite narcissistic, because it's kind of like saying, I won't believe it unless I experience it. I don't really buy the accounts that are kind of coming to me through other means. And that's kind of, I would say, slightly insulting to mainly the Ukrainians themselves, but also to the very brave reporters who are spending their time trying to find Ukrainians to talk to them and to fill the newspapers with kind of testimony from those people.
And I think we have to acknowledge that this isn't all just about, wanting to learn from our past and our mistakes. There's an element of just rubbernecking. For example, there's Titanic. There's new footage of the wreckage has just been released by a commercial exploration company that charges $250,000 for tickets to go down in a submersible and view the wreckage close up. And this footage is already getting millions of views on YouTube. But alongside the ethical questions about disturbing a site that may also function as a graveyard, there's also been a lot of anger over court battles, over requests to recover artifacts from the wreckage. And historians point out, this was over a century ago. There is nothing new to be learned.
But that comes back to my question of time, though, doesn't it? I mean, Mariana, you refused to answer it the first time. I'm going to try again. There is an element of how long has passed, which is whether this sort of passes the sniff test, doesn't it? So something like the Titanic, even something like the Second World War, or even the Falklands, people can be nerdishly interested in those subjects, have loads of books on them and say, yeah, I'm a geek for this subject, and not feel like they're being disrespectful. It is disrespectful to say, oh yeah, I love the war in Ukraine, I want to go and see it. It's just obviously disrespectful. So at what point do you say, well, enough time has passed, maybe like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, enough time has passed, so I'll go to Belfast and see the graffiti, and it doesn't feel disrespectful?
I think what I was trying to avoid answering is pinpointing the precise time after which it is socially acceptable to visit a site of tragedy. But I have to agree with you. I mean, when I went to visit Istanbul, I was super enthralled by the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire, and having studied empires before, it's sort of like always so much of it goes around war and very violent encounters as well. And these are all sites, like they sort of all happen on planet Earth. I mean, so far.
I mean, it's interesting that we're having a discussion, Leaf, about whether or not we'd visit Ukraine. But in a way, a bigger discussion that we should be having relates to the bigger country, doesn't it? Do you think British tourists will visit St. Petersburg and Moscow again anytime soon?
Don't think they'll be doing it in their droves anytime soon. And obviously, I think we've covered in the podcast before this the potential move or the pressure by Finland to stop Russian tourists going on holiday in the EU. And I think that the war in Ukraine has probably tarnished romantic ideas of Russia that maybe have been persisting for since the sort of 19th century. And that English tourists probably won't feel safe to go to St. Petersburg and Moscow. And rightly so, because we've seen people, sent to prison for pretty non-substantial things, including that athlete from America who supposedly was caught with some marijuana, I think, on her person, and now she's in jail. So no, I don't think we're going to be seeing that many people making that reverse journey to St. Petersburg, which is where, or Moscow, which is where the war is kind of emanating from.
Mariana.
I was just going to underscore Leaf's point that Estonia has seen a 50% decrease in the number of cruise ships that are docking in Tallinn as a direct effect of the war, and not necessarily as a result of fear, but actually as a result of the fact that they can no longer visit St. Petersburg, which is a major attraction in the Baltic Sea cruises.
Can I just add that my friend who just got married to a lovely Canadian man, she told me that some of the people, the guests from Canada, were a bit wary of coming over for the wedding because of a fear of that there was a war in Europe. Which I found pretty striking, that across the pond, people think that it's kind of, sort of slightly war zone type place.
Well, that's it, isn't it, Kari? I mean, so finally on this, for people that are trying to organise trips to Ukraine, even if at the moment the government says don't come, ultimately they're looking around and saying, well, it is safe here, or as safe as it can be for a country that's at war. We are not being bombed at the moment. We have a historic city. We still have all the tourist attractions we had before the war. What's wrong in telling people to come?
Actually, the company that are organising these tours admit that nowhere in Ukraine is totally safe, and some of the cities that you can visit are still under attack. So I guess their argument, going back to it, it's just that how can you, if you really want to galvanize people to do something, they need to be here. And there have been, even though air traffic has been suspended above Ukraine, there have been 1 million foreigners cross the border since Russia attacked and beginning of July, and they're not all aid workers, politicians and journalists. So clearly some people, for whatever reason, are feeling the need to go there.
Okay. Leaf, you're up next after this. Okay, Leaf, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Happy birthday to a two-headed creature.
Polycephaly is a condition where an animal is born with two heads. Some cultures think of it as a blessing, while others think it is a curse. Or if you're playing Fallout, a two-headed cow is pretty much normal, actually. Either way, no matter what people think, one thing we can all agree on is that creatures with this condition are truly weird.
10 weird two-headed animals. A video from YouTube channel Top 5 Best. Leaf, your story of the week.
This week, I've been thinking a lot about a two-headed tortoise with the very appropriate name of Janus, who's just celebrated his 25th birthday at a natural history museum in Switzerland, where he was born. Now, tortoises, probably our listeners will know, tend to live for quite a long time, and it's not unusual to meet one that's over 25. But generally in the wild, two-headed animals do not do well at all, which we can, I'm sure, get into. But this animal has been kept alive basically because of the total devotion of the army of carers that have been looking after him for all these years.
Yes. And Janus, appropriately enough, you said, for those of us who aren't classical scholars, why is that?
Because it refers to an ancient Roman god. It's the god of kind of beginnings, gates, transitions. And this god is usually portrayed above doorways, for instance, with two heads. So there's a kind of an obvious physical resemblance.
Okay. So we're sort of back to tourism in a way, aren't we, Kari, which we were just discussing? I mean, I don't know if you'd call this dark tourism or not, but certainly it's something kooky that has been drawing crowds to Switzerland to see him where he lives, and that's why economically it makes sense to look after him and keep him alive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and this tortoise has a cushy life. He was hatched at and he's cared for by a team from the Geneva Natural History Museum. He's fed organic salad. He's given daily massages and baths and green tea and chamomile. He's taken
like
walks on a custom made, yeah, just like him, it's just like Day in the Office, on a custom made skateboard, sometimes with music. I mean, he has a nice life, but I think it does raise some interesting questions about the different values we put on different animals. I mean, we all have a part to play, at the risk of sounding very moralizing, but we all have a part to play in the world system. And yet, animals that interest us, that are cute or offer some sort of scientific value for research or whatever, we much prefer those over sort of your bog standard, snakes. And interestingly, apparently this condition that causes two-headedness is particularly common among snakes, but I don't see any visitors flocking to see any of those.
Well, I mean, I would, given the opportunity, be more interested in a two-headed snake than a one-headed snake, but maybe I'm market research of one. I mean, conservation work is about sustaining all the boring species, isn't it, Mariana? It's not about conserving the ones with two heads. They are the anomalies. Actually, we do seem to prioritize interesting animals over the less appealing ones.
Definitely. Although the WWF fund has the sort of like the panda as its main animal, but it's actually when I was studying this some years ago, it's actually as a representative of the ecosystem. So if you save this cute animal, you will also sort of protect the whole ecosystem and all the other animals that live around it. So it's got extra points there. But on the other question that you're asking, Olly, I was thinking about the albino animals, right? These are unique creatures that have partial or complete loss of pigmentation. And the birth of one is actually considered sacred or an auspicious event in some cultures. But research shows that they have difficulty in surviving in the wild. I mean, they face so many obstacles in nature. They're naturally more prone to poor eyesight, which means they're at a hunting disadvantage. They have trouble finding a mate, and they're incapable of camouflaging, which is especially the case for albino alligators. I don't know if you've seen one, but they're adorable. And
Take your word for it.
they're also more vulnerable to poachers who are looking to capitalize on the booming demand for exotic pets or products that are derived from rare creatures. And cue in here the albino deers, which are also adorable.
And Janus, as you alluded to earlier, Leaf, is in danger too, if left to his own devices and not looked after in this pampering regime.
Yes, so Janus, poor thing, can't retract his head into his shell, which is partly why tortoises with two heads don't really survive for very long in the wild. Also, can I just add on the snake front that two-headed snakes are crazy, not only because they look weird, but sometimes because the heads try and eat each other. So it seems that Janus has a good relationship. The two heads that that form Janus have a good relationship with each other. They've actually got quite different personalities.
Can I just, on the two heads that form Janus, can I just drill into that
Yes.
for a second? Because this is the thing that it was, I know it's very 2022
Yes.
to make this all about pronouns. But why is it a he and not a they? Because it does seem to be two tortoises. And if, in other species, we talk about conjoined twins, for example. In humans, we talk about as two individuals. Why not with Janus?
Well, I think it's just to do with the zoo handlers who've decided that Janus is just Janus singular. And actually, on the human front, it's not a guarantee that that humans that are born with two heads do have two names. I was reading about a person in India who just goes by one name. But then, for instance, in America in 1990, two women were born called, I think, Brittany and Abigail, and they are now teachers at a school, and they have one body but two heads, and they have two kind of separate identities. So I think basically it's culturally decided whether we give these people two identities or one.
There probably is an argument for giving Janus two different identities, I'd have said, because he's also apparently, hasn't he, got two hearts and two pairs of lungs.
But one digestive system.
Yeah, and his carers say he has two very distinct personalities. Apparently the right head is quite dominant, and the left is, quote, more passive and loves to eat.
Good.
I don't know what you want to do with that information.
In all seriousness, though, Leaf, as far as one can at this point in the show, why is this your story of the week? What do you think, the repercussions of this story for all of us listening?
I think that not all stories have to have a kind of global importance, but I would say that it's something, it reminds us of the fact that humans actually can cherish creatures, and that we can look after animals and really help them if we choose to. So it's a reminder of the potential of humanity to cause good, rather than just bad.
Can I jump in with a darker take on events, in that this kind of just reminds me of the travelling carnivals of yesteryear? Let's come and see the freaky animals. The whole social media furore, for example, that surrounded Grumpy Cat. This permanently grumpy looking cat that had a facial expression caused by an underbite and feline dwarfism, and I think it's good that we look after these creatures, but there is just an element of perhaps this love of freak shows that underlying it.
But again, we're back to sort of human instinct, aren't we? If it's good that a natural history museum looks after the animal, it can't be bad that people take pictures of it because they're interested in it.
And I guess the scientific research, valid scientific research that they can learn stuff from it.
It's also just, reading all the quotes from his keepers, I think one of the major things that comes through is that all of these keepers at the Natural History Museum are sort of in love with this little tortoise. They really like caring for it. And so, and that I think is nice. I don't think those people are motivated by, the freak show vibe. I think they're more like, oh, this is a really cute tortoise, and we've got to give him a Vaseline rub every day, and what a joy that is.
Okay, well, happy birthday, Janus, if you are listening. Actually, no, I know he speaks French. Well, there we are. A victory for French. We've come full circle. You better not move to Algeria. My thanks to Leif, Kari and Mariana. You can follow us for free and get every episode as soon as we release them by searching for The Week Unwrapped. Wherever you get your podcast, just tap follow. And remember as well to check out our sister show from the week, The Overview. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.